For those of you who have not joined us before, we're going to cruise through this program, hopefully in like 20 minutes-ish. And then Denise is going to end with a little review of ritual. That's something that we are trying this year, just to keep it in front of all of us.
Although today it's going to be on the badge. We
Mm.
have badge day, so it's not really ritual.
Kate, thank you for being our co-host and bouncer. Anyone who is not familiar with Mary Kate, she is my foundation co-worker in stewardship. So if you feel well stewarded by the foundation, it's because of MK.
And if you don't, let me know.
That's right.
We'll make sure you do.
You may recognize her from, I forget what convention I talked you into putting a docent dress on for the foundation walk. Was that
That would be 2014 Houston.
Oh, that's why we were sweating through our docent costume.
Yes.
So hot.
Someone decided to do a 5K in Houston.
You were a
at
good
convention.
sport. You were a good sport to dress as Minnie Stewart. Definitely wasn't hazing.
Not at all.
No. All right. Well, you want to get started, Denise, or you want me to wait another minute?
No, we're good.
Okay. Well, good evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Historically Speaking. Hope you had a nice President's Day weekend. Might we offer Denise Rugani, our own former president, a happy President's Day weekend? I asked her if we could do this program on my own favorite president, Millard Fillmore, lucky number 13, last of the Whigs, but she said it had to be on Kappa presidents. But I'm not too upset because this is a really cool group to cover. For those following at home, this is the 4th episode of covering Kappa's loyal leaders, the women who served as president of the larger organization. And so we are up to the 1920s.
So the remarkable women who guided Kappa Kappa Gamma during the early 20th century, Sarah Harris Rowe, Mary Whiting Westerman, Georgia Hayden Lloyd Jones, Florence Tomlinson Myers Wallace, and Alice Tillotson Barney, collectively shaped the fraternity's growth, resilience, and identity. Their leadership advanced alumni involvement, expanded chapters across North America, strengthened governance, and established essential structures such as the central office. Their vision sparked service initiatives, including support for fatherless French children during World War I, ensured the preservation of Kappa's history, and inspired rigorous standards for chapter operation.
Together, these leaders embodied courage, dedication, and an unwavering belief in the power of women's communities. Whether navigating the challenges of the Depression, advocating for academic excellence, or forging new paths for member support and involvement, they demonstrated that meaningful leadership blends integrity, service, and compassion. Their legacy continues to inspire Kappas to lead boldly, serve generously, and uphold the ideals that have carried the fraternity forward for 156 years.
The Fraternity Council career of Sarah Harris started in 1914 when she attended convention and was elected Grand Vice President, a newly created office to handle alumni affairs. It was the first time an officer for alumni affairs would serve on council. 3 former offices had been merged, and Sarah had to invent the job. It was hers for the next 6 years, during which she urged the establishment of alumni associations. She said, "Just now, when fraternities are being so much censored, so closely watched, and their very right to exist questioned, we want Kappa Kappa Gamma to know that its alumni are loyal and alive to their responsibilities."
As Grand Vice President, she visited chapters, organized alumni associations, and established cooperation between the two. She not only increased the voting power of alumni, but also their sense of obligation. She sent letters to the Key asking for contributions, asked alumni for their opinions, she notified them of changes in policy, and sent clubs annual report blanks and copies of official fraternity material. No one had worked with alumni in such organized, onward-looking ways before. Sarah was also the alumna editor of The Key. In 1917, she asked, and I love this quote, "What of us who are not at the front? We can't all be missionaries. We can't all speak at suffrage meetings, but we must all serve somewhere."
In what proved to be a historic move, she asked for an article for the key of Dorothy Canfield Fisher from the Beta Nu chapter at Ohio State, who in turn appealed to Kappas to become involved with French children, left destitute by the ravages of war. The response to her plea was so large that Kappa's work of World War I began. For years, the poor of France could knock on a door labeled Kappa Kappa Gamma and receive free medical and dental care. Sarah was elected Grand President at the Golden Jubilee Convention in 1920, and at the conclusion of her term in 1922, she recommended the establishment of Kappa's first central office with a paid executive secretary. That role would eventually be filled by Della Lawrence from the Beta Chi chapter at Texas. Until that time, fraternity officers had carried on all the business of the fraternity. During her term of office in December 1921, she married Richard Rowe.
A cum laude graduate with a liberal arts degree, Sarah was registrar and later dean of women at the School of Speech Communication at Northwestern University and served on a number of boards and commissions from 1939 to 1952. She was also mother of 2 sons and a daughter, Sally Harris Kanega, who became a Kappa at Upsilon chapter at Northwestern, and grandmother to Anne Kanega, who joined Epsilon Nu chapter at Vanderbilt.
The next one is my favorite, May Cynthia Whiting Westerman from Sigma chapter at Nebraska. May Westerman is the only Kappa to have served 3 terms as president, first as Grand President from 1902 to 1904, and the next as its first national president from 1922 to 24 and 1924 to 26. Her name is on the charters of 8 chapters and on the membership certificates of approximately 3,000 Kappas. Most notably of all, Mary Whiting Westerman researched and edited the long-awaited history of Kappa Kappa Gamma fraternity, 1870 to 1930. And in a convention toast in 1932, she famously said, "Buy the history, read the history, never write a history." May was a sweet-faced woman with a commanding presence who embodied the ideals of Kappa in courage, mentality, honesty, and vision, and she had a head for detail.
We covered her first term as Grand President in a previous episode, so let's jump ahead to when she was elected the first national president in 1922. During that term, she accepted the gift of a gavel carved from a stairway at Monmouth's Old Main, which was first used at the 1928 convention. The devastating fraternity headquarters fire in 1965 damaged the Monmouth gavel. It was replaced at convention by the Westerman gavel, first given in 1904 to May by her council and then left to the fraternity. At the end of her term as Grand President in 1904, she was appointed historian, but resigned in 1905, and she did no work for a number of years. In 1918, however, the one-time adjunct professor and lover of English literature resumed her Kappa service as custodian of the badge. She later attended the 1922 convention, where she was unanimously elected national president. During the historic 2 terms that followed, she served as 1923 delegate to the National Panhellenic Congress, which is now known as Conference, and that was in Boston at a time when opposition to fraternities was gathering at a number of universities.
At the end of what would have been her 3rd term in 1924, Kappa had 51 chapters, a huge number for council members to visit, and May pressed for further development of province government. The provinces were what we now call districts. In 1925, the resignation of the historian was accepted with regret, and council took on the daunting task of publishing a history. May assumed this task and at the same time presided over revising, printing, and distributing the bylaws and standing rules. She spent hours helping verify rolls for the catalog and oversaw production of a pamphlet promoting the benefits of college fraternities to be used as a continuous, as-needed balance to anti-fraternity sentiment. The re-establishment of Rowe Chapter, Ohio Wesleyan, was a highlight of 1925, and in 1926, May offered to act as editor rather than author of the history, acknowledging the task of authorship too difficult on top of her other duties.
Still, the task was intimidating over the next 4 years, as few chapters or past presidents responded to her plea for research and writing assistance. Her publishing goal of October 1930, 60 years after the founding of Kappa, came and went, and she felt personally a failure. But May persevered, and the thick blue and gold bound volume was presented with pride and the aforementioned caveat against history writing in 1932. It is a volume full of fascination, of questions answered and unanswered. It is the Kappas who wrote it and took part in it. It is Mae Westerman. It is the fraternity, and now it's a collector's item. May continued to serve Kappa when, in 1934, the work of historian was separated from ritualist, and she took on the latter task. But don't get any ideas, Denise, because the perfect role is currently ritual and history director. So thank you for serving so capably.
May's efforts and loyalty were recognized with the presentation of the Westerman Cup, later known as the Efficiency Award, and after the Greatest Chapter Award. The retired cup is engraved. To own the cup, a chapter must have served the fraternity in a small measure as our national president has, meeting its demands entirely, unselfishly, unceasingly. And now May is the first president to be highlighted in 2 different episodes of Historically Speaking.
Which is so fitting for our May. Our next president is Georgia Hayden Lloyd Jones from Ada chapter at Wisconsin. Mae Westerman was the first national president, and Georgia was the second. This second national president once said her childhood dream was to have been an Elizabethan in an age of enthusiasm, discovery, devotion, and activity. We have this in common. She then said, quote, "I am living my wish in Kappa Kappa Gamma." When elected national president in 1926, Georgia was just finishing a term as National Director of Provinces. That was a position created at the 1924 convention, the bulk of which involved extension or opening new chapters on new campuses. In her last act as director, she graciously presented her gift of the May Whiting Westerman Cup to, quote, "encourage that efficiency without which we make no progress."
When elected, she was also vice president of the Tulsa Tribune Company and associate editor of that newspaper. Before, she and her husband, also a journalist, had lived in New York, where she was one of a group of reporters who marched with Margaret Sanger, an early advocate of birth control. They also lived in Connecticut and Wisconsin. After college, she had studied and traveled extensively in Europe, specializing in literature and philosophy. Her first 2 years on council were involved with extension, chapter visits, and province conventions. An assistant was hired for Della Burt, the new executive secretary. A catalog was completed, and the Rose McGill Fund became a focus, as Rose McGill, Beta Psi Toronto, had died, and use of the funds could be expanded beyond just Rose's care. The drive for fraternity endowment became the leading feature of Georgia's administration. She was also concerned with serious problems of discipline, ranging from cheating in class to actual immorality in the technical sense.
I want to know what she means by actual immorality in the technical sense. A comprehensive report form for chapter visits had been drawn up, a standard form for data on prospective members had been issued, and a pamphlet for freshman training was in the works. All chapters had received a book of ritual. Georgia's contagious enthusiasm for extension resulted in 9 new chapters during her 4 years as president. Gamma Omicron at Wyoming, Gamma Pi at Alabama, Gamma Sigma at Manitoba, Gamma Tau at North Dakota State, Gamma Upsilon at British Columbia, Gamma Phi at Southern Methodist, Gamma Chi at George Washington, Gamma Psi at Maryland, and Gamma Omega at Denison. She established a committee to survey chapter standards, saying, quote, "college women of today neither think nor act as did those of former decades." Co-organizer scholarships, the forerunner of chapter consultant scholarships, were also established, and Georgia realized the need for a traveling inspector, which I think is a better use of the term today, leadership consultant, so that they could relieve council members of so much travel.
In 1928, convention was the first at which alumni outnumbered collegians, and Georgia opened it with the gavel made from the wood of the stairwell at Old Main at Monmouth. Convention Marshal Margaret Dixon Foley from Upsilon chapter at Northwestern said of Georgia at the convention, "Here was beauty, dignity, and strength, combined with a keen mind and an obvious flair for business." At the Ada Province meeting of 1967, Georgia received a 75-year pin from Director of Membership Marion Schroeder Graham. As Georgia's daughter, also a Kappa, looked on. Georgia, whose two sons also married Kappa, said, "Kappa has been very much of a factor in my life. To a surprising extent, it has been influenced by friendship and experiences. It has brought me much satisfaction, and all because of the lucky choice 3/4 of a century ago." In her honor, the Tulsa alumni gave the fraternity an antique English silver coffee urn, since retired, to be presented to the chapter with the greatest improvement in scholarship.
Two interesting facts I found about Georgia that hadn't been written in our Kappa history books were that the Tulsa Tribune, the paper that was owned by her husband and of which she was the vice president and associate editor, also has later been noted by historians as publishing inflammatory headlines that likely led to the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. I would love to hear Georgia's take on that or an interview of either of them. Her husband, you'll notice the name, was also a cousin of Frank Lloyd Wright, and that famous architect built them a home in Tulsa that is often called West Hope. It's only one of 3 Wright homes in Oklahoma, and it's on the National Register of Historical Places. Now on to another one of my favorites, Florence Tomlinson Myers Wallace. She's from the Gamma Theta chapter at Drake. And though she was grand president only a few months, Florence left an indelible mark on the fraternity. Also, we should point out the change in names from grand president to national president. So May and Georgia served as national presidents, and then they decided to go back to grand president. So that's not a mistake that Florence was known as the grand president. She left an indelible mark on the fraternity. In high school, she won awards in leadership, service, and journalism, and she was the first female to edit the school's newspaper and the yearbook. As a Gamma Theta at Drake, Florence was correspondent to the Key and chapter president. She attended her first Kappa convention in 1924, and 2 years later, she became the first assistant to Executive Secretary Della Lawrence Burt, and she made herself indispensable until her return to Drake to serve as the assistant to the Dean of Law at that school in 1928.
That same year, she was unanimously elected National Registrar, and she assumed once more duties of the assistant to the Executive Secretary. She was faced with the collection and binding of the fraternity files and completion of chapter files. She had presided over the installation of Gamma Chi George Washington and Gamma Psi University of Maryland in 1929, and so was familiar with the procedure when she went to the installation of Delta Alpha Penn State in October of 1930 as Grand President. When elected, she was 25 years old, which was young compared to the presidents who had served since 1912. Just a month before her election in July, she had married Irving Myers. In December, Florence's pregnancy with her first child, a daughter, made it necessary for her to resign. Vice President Alice Barney was appointed to fill the unexpired term from December 1930 until 1932.
Florence, who also had a son, was twice widowed, but continued to pursue a full life of activities, work, and honors, including the international presidency of the PEO Sisterhood, a philanthropic and educational organization. In March 1973, Florence received her 50-year pin and whispered to fraternity president Marion Schroeder Graham that it was the happiest day of her life.
And finally, we have Alice Tillotson Barney from Chi chapter at Minnesota. Allison is the only president to have died in office, a fact that overshadows the bright career of a handsome, quietly dedicated, charming Kappa who forcefully filled the unexpired term of her predecessor and guided Kappa during a time of immense difficulty, the Great Depression. Till, as she was called, came to office with a great deal of experience. She had been a Chi chapter House Board member in 1912, treasurer of the House Corporation from 1920, loyal member of the Minnesota Alumni Association, and correspondent to the Key up to the 1928 convention in her home state. She was vice president of Epsilon Province in 1925 and province president in 1927. Chairman of the Social Committee, she was elected grand vice president in 1928 and re-elected at the convention of 1930. 3 months later, upon the resignation of Florence Wallace, Alice Barney was sworn in as grand president.
It was an exciting time in the history of the fraternity. Headquarters had been moved to Columbus from St. Louis, and retiring Executive Secretary Della Lawrence Burt had been replaced by Clara O. Pierce. She was from Beta Nu chapter at Ohio State, and she would devote the rest of her life to that role until 1969. At the end of Alice's first term, she praised Clara's vigilance in helping the fraternity deal with the difficulties of the times. Fraternities were still under criticism, and Alice said, quote, "The time has come for us to take heed. If we can maintain our usefulness and prove definitely that we are essential to our communities, we will have established our right to exist." The following term was no easier, with banks closed and province conventions canceled.
Yet during Alice's term, the history of Kappa Kappa Gamma fraternity, 1870 to 1930, had been printed and 8 new chapters were installed, all but 2 by Alice: Delta Alpha Penn State, Delta Beta Duke, Delta Gamma Michigan State, Delta Delta McGill, Delta Epsilon Rollins, Delta Zeta Colorado College, Delta Eta Utah, and Delta Theta Goucher. She said, "I am truly thankful we have come out of the year so well and only hope that next year will be better for us and the country at large." She added that this year has been a strenuous one, and I hope there will never be another one exactly like it. After the installation of Delta Theta at Goucher in September of 1933, Alice went to visit a Chi friend in Connecticut. She suffered an acute heart attack and died on October 3rd at the age of 47. The fraternity later endowed a bed at the University of Minnesota Hospital in Alice Barney's name.
I hate to end on that sad note, but our time is coming close, and so I want to be sure and allow time for you to review some ritual for us, Denise.